All right. Well, welcome to Maynard Costerisan's nonprofit education series. We're excited to kick off the summer with this second quarter webinar. During this session, we're going to be talking about realigning human resource and finance roles to advance your organization's mission. I'd like to introduce to you our speakers for today. We are joined by Sarah Jennings, who is a principal at Maynard Costerisan and leads our consulting services division. She also spearheads our nonprofit team. And Sarah is joined today by Jodi Schafer from HRM Services. Jodi is a certified senior professional in human resources and the owner of HRM Services. I know we have a lot to gain from the information that Sarah and Jodi will be sharing with us, including a little bit more about themselves. So without further ado, I'll hand things off to Sarah to get us started.
Thank you so very much, Kimberly. We are excited to be here today. And I will go ahead and share my screen so we can really get going. So as Kimberly said, we are excited to be here to chat more about structuring the nonprofit for success and really talking more about HR and finance and how everything blends together. Today, we're going to talk a little bit, obviously talk about introductions, a little bit more about ourselves, structuring HR, then finance, and then talk about how they really overlap within the payroll and the HR and everything else realm. And then we should have some time for questions, but as Cheyenne said, or Kimberly, pardon me, said, please feel free to put those in at any time. So as Kimberly said, my name's Sarah. I'm excited to be here. I started in the audit department, just a little bit about my past. So I was in the audit department. I've been with Maynard for over 20 years. I won't get into dates past that. I moved from the audit department to the accounting department, oversaw some software configurations. Then I went to kind of a fractional CFO outsourced accounting role. And now I do consulting work, which focuses on data analytics, process improvement, organizational structure of finance teams. And we continue to see that overlap of how do we make sure that everything's operating efficiently and effectively while in keeping controls in place and things like that. So that's one of the biggest reasons that we were really excited to partner with Jodi and HRM to bring you here today. Jodi?
Sarah. My name is Jodi Schafer. I'm the owner of HRM Services. We are based in the Lansing area here in Michigan, but we do have clients nationwide. A lot of our clients are in the nonprofit space. And so nonprofits can vary in size, which means their HR needs vary along with that level of complexity, internal knowledge, and capacity. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is how to think about your HR function and the flexibility of your HR function based on the needs of your organization, and then recognizing that as your needs change, the way in which you source your HR component will change as well. And sometimes those needs can be met internally, sometimes externally, and oftentimes a mix of both. And then, as Sarah said, there's kind of that overlap between HR and finance. So even within your own teams, how those functions are communicating with each other, the division of work, that kind of thing. We'll jump right in. So again, my focus is all on HR. I mean, human resources, right? The name human. So there is a people component to the work, but there's also a process component, and then there's a risk component. So when you think about HR, I'm really talking about those three areas, and I'll just sort of briefly list for you a couple of things that in my mind sort of fall under each one of the three umbrellas. The people side of the work, I think, is the most obvious for everybody. That's everything from onboarding to training, coaching, and that could be career coaching, moving people from one position to the next, kind of based on their capabilities, their interest, and what your needs are. Performance development, performance evaluation system, so giving that ongoing feedback when it's going well and maybe when it's not going so well, which kind of leads me to corrective action that often falls in the HR bucket. Leadership training, communication training, anti-harassment training. Training is a big part of what HR is meant to do. Again, that doesn't mean it has to be done in-house. You can sometimes outsource that, but it does sort of fall under our umbrella. And then employee appreciation. All of that is sort of the people component of the work. But then there's a process component of the work too. And I think this is where we see a lot of overlap with finance sometimes. Hiring, for example, the whole hiring process and getting somebody not just fit for the role that you have open and sort of vetting a candidate, et cetera, but then how do you get them onboarded, so to speak, within the organization, both in terms of skill training, but also on the payroll side of things. How do we get them set up for benefits and payroll and get all the forms and paperwork, et cetera? And that's where we see a lot of overlap often with finance or accounting. Benefit administration is another area. I kind of put that under process, but often overlapping with finance because, benefits aren't free. We're having to pay for those. So the invoice is coming in and we're making sure we're paying for people that are still actually on our roster at the right amounts and that those deductions, if there are any, are coming out of payroll. Health and safety also sort of falls under HR's purview. Again, this could be anything from anti-harassment training to there's a slip and fall at work and you need to have an accident or an injury report. Maybe work comp is involved in that. This could be mental health as well and some of the strategies around that. Payroll, we talked about unemployment benefits. If somebody files for those, the processing of that paperwork, if you're not using an alliance for that, leaves of absence, time off, comp adjustments, all of that to me falls under process. But again, that's under HR's umbrella. And then the third category, risk. HR really does have a handle in managing risk. This is everything from your pay practices, making sure that we aren't doing things that would be viewed as discriminatory or have a negative impact on employee morale, retention, et cetera. Separations and discipline, some of the riskiest things that any of your team members will be involved in. And HR often is the kind of the guiding voice in that, sometimes with legal help to help assess how much risk and then how do we mitigate risk if we do decide to go forward with this action that we want to take. Workplace complaints, workplace investigations. So it's just a long-winded way of saying HR is really complex. And as your organization grows in size, the needs in any one of those areas will change. And so how you staff the HR function should also change. I've just kind of set the stage. I put together kind of 4 different categories of growth and typically where we see the term HR, what that means in each one of those categories based on your size. And so we'll go into that first. The first one, I kind of call it the startup phase. This doesn't mean that if you have a small team, you're necessarily a startup, but in that phase, one for me, in the startup phase, often the focus of HR is all around some foundational processes and basics. So this is generally when you have 1 to 10-ish staff members. This is not an exact science, by the way. But generally, it's a small enough team that one individual can kind of keep their hands around some of the people parts of the job, right? Deciding when we need to hire, being actively involved in the vetting process, having a handle on some of the training, making sure that that's going, giving some of the feedback. And oftentimes that doesn't sit with an HR practitioner just because of size. It often sits with maybe it's the executive director or the president of the organization. Sometimes it'll sit with the deputy director, or if they have somebody kind of in charge of operations, kind of that internal facing role, this HR function often sits with them. And the joke is, right, this is the other duties as assigned. So they don't typically have HR as part of their job title. It just is one of the functions that they do because they have a people responsibility with the other work that they're responsible for. And generally, HR in this size of an organization is really focused around, it's mostly transactional. Like we have a few positions, we have some job descriptions in place. We may not have a handbook, but we sort of know what our policies are, and we're small enough that we relay those verbally, or maybe we have some standalone policy or procedure documents that we just sort of give to new hires. It's not really cohesive typically. It's not very sophisticated typically because it's not necessary. It's not, the organization is not working at a size where the complexity requires more sophistication than that. So, it's the KISS principle. Just keep it simple. And often we can do that internally. And then on that resource allocation component, generally organizations of this size can manage 80 to 90% of the have-tos under HR by themselves. And then every so often, they'll need an external partner to help when they get into a situation that's either over their head in terms of skill set or it's a capacity issue. We have to hire, but we have to hire 3 positions. And we don't have anyone in-house that has the time to source for all 3. So you might partner with an external person, right? Or a company like HRM to help you with that initial vetting and screening process. Or maybe you get a workplace complaint and no one in-house knows how to handle that, but you do know it's high risk if you mishandle it. And so you reach out to an external partner to come in and do the workplace investigation. But most of the day-to-day is sort of handled in-house and typically not by somebody with an HR designation. The next slide shows kind of that next level of growth. Oh, I'll pause here while we're switching the slide. Looks like we've got a poll that's come up. So if you want to just take a moment, answer the poll. As your organization grows in size, and so for this one, I kind of put 11 to 50, the HR focus shifts from just kind of transactional foundational basics to actually building structures, because now you have enough employees that verbally, the telephone game doesn't work anymore for relaying how we do things or what the rule is around certain things. And we started to build management structures in place where one person isn't in charge of the whole team anymore. We have multiple managers. And so we have to make sure everybody's sort of operating from the same playbook. So this is typically where we start seeing the need for more cohesive policies, maybe a dedicated handbook. Perhaps benefit administration is now becoming a job responsibility because you're large enough that you're offering health insurance or dental insurance, that kind of thing. And this is, again, where you start to decide, like, do we need more of a dedicated HR presence in-house? And if so, is it full-time? Is it part-time? Are they doing the transactional things? And then we're going to lean on a partner for the more strategic things. And there's no right answer for this. Generally, what we see is that, again, there's an in-house point person. Maybe they're handling, maybe 80% of kind of the day-to-day. It's really functional. So it's kind of a carryover from those earlier days where the staff size was smaller. The focus is more functional. And then again, when there's a need based on either a higher level skill set, more strategy, or we're building a new structure we didn't have in place, maybe we're creating performance evaluation processes that didn't exist before. We might lean on an external partner to help us create those, and then in-house we can administer those once they're in place. So we see that kind of partnership. And then again, on the capacity side, if there's a heavy lift coming that would typically fall into the HR bucket, nobody internally has the time to do it, then you might lean on that external person for some assistance there. As you grow beyond 50s, this is where specialization and technology often becomes much more of a focus around HR. So, you might start having a dedicated HR employee at this size who has HR training and some designations. They're often acting as a generalist. One HR professional can typically handle a staff of 100 people if it is their full-time dedicated role. They may still lean on an external partner, again, for specialized skills, maybe some capacity issues. But this is, I think, where often the conversation starts happening around, do we want our internal person to be focused more on strategy and the people parts of the job where we see real value, where they can be an embodiment of our mission and we can have kind of our way of doing things and how we treat people? And do we want to outsource the more functional areas of HR, those administrative tasks? Maybe we don't want our one HR generalist to be processing payroll. So maybe that's something that we hand off to our accounting department. Maybe we're outsourcing both of those functions, and both our financial staff and our HR staff are operating at a higher or more strategic level because we've outsourced kind of the day-to-day function to a third party. That's often less expensive. It helps create some redundancy as well, because if you just have one person in-house that's doing all of it and they go on vacation or they get sick or they leave, you don't have those systems in place. And so having that external partner Even if their job responsibilities typically are more administrative or functional in nature, they could step in on the strategy piece if you needed them to, and at least it builds a little bit of backfill opportunities for you. So all your eggs aren't in one basket. And then the final slide here in terms of size, this is where you're over 100 employees. You're growing, the work is very complex. Maybe you're running multiple programs. Maybe you have some for-profit subsidiaries that are kind of flowing in. And generally the needs in this area change. This is where you start seeing like HR departments of more than one. Maybe those HR professionals are starting to specialize. You could have somebody that's solely focused on, comp and benefits. You could have somebody perhaps solely focused on recruiting or learning and development. And so it really just depends on the mission of your organization and some of your strategic goals as to how you allocate those resources. But at this stage and beyond, I do think it's really important that the HR professionals you have that are in-house are focused on value add and strategic initiatives. And perhaps it's cheaper at this point to outsource more of the functional administrative responsibilities, to a third party and not tie those up with your in-house resources. A couple of considerations, kind of considering this in-house, internal versus external. Everything is going to be unique to your organization and your needs. So the idea that employee headcount can sort of point you in a direction is maybe a good place to start your thinking, but there's no have-tos on this. Just because your organization has 10 employees doesn't mean that you may not decide that you want somebody, one of those 10, to have a strategic HR role. So it's really based on the mission and how you want to choose to operate internally. And then there's that question about, transactional or administrative duties versus kind of those more strategic or people-centered responsibilities. And how do you want to split that? Which ones do you want to push outside? Which ones do you want to keep inside? Assuming maybe you want to go with that hybrid approach. You don't have to. There are organizations that do all of this 100% in-house, and then on a very rare kind of as-needed basis, will reach out to a third party. It's not like a retainer agreement or anything like that. It's simply as needed fee for service. So that's perfectly acceptable as well. There's no right way to do this here. Generally, though, organizations do choose, if they're going to have a partner, an external partner, they do choose to keep the more strategic tasks, the more value add tasks in-house, because you have direct control over those individuals, the decisions that are made, and that's their sole focus. So any of those people contact type roles, I think, you want the people that are working for you to feel like HR is personal. So if you outsource everything and you didn't have an internal point person, then the question is, how do you keep that personal feel? So that's something to consider. And then, of course, why would you ever consider outsourcing part or all of your HR? It's a cost benefit analysis, really. And then the assurance that whoever's handling it externally has the expertise necessary to do it and to do it well. So just a final few slides here before I turn it over to Sarah on the finance side. I've talked about the size of your organization being one of the factors that you can think about when you to determine how you want to structure HR. The complexity of your organization, obviously your financial resources are going to play into this. Can you afford to bring talent in-house? Is it cheaper for you to outsource? If so, which pieces? Strategic goals, technology, flexibility, all of that, right? So there's no one size fits all here, and there are a lot of things to consider when you're making this decision. Sarah, the next slide is just a bit of a summary slide, but in the essence of time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to talk about the finance piece, and then we can talk about how the two intersect.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So moving into kind of the finance considerations, we're going to look at some trends that we're seeing just within finance and accounting departments, structures, different structure considerations, some gaps and needs that we're seeing, and then what options do organizations have, specifically nonprofits, but really much of this applies to for-profit and nonprofit organizations. So some of the things that we're seeing right now is, and hopefully some of these things are really hitting home with you. Well, hopefully and maybe unfortunately, because they're not all easy to deal with, but significant transitions and loss of institutional knowledge. We've got a lot of folks within the accounting and finance department and nonprofit organizations who are at or nearing retirement age. And that institutional knowledge loss is really hurting the industry, to be honest. There's a lot of people that have just been around. They may or may not have done documentation on everything, but that data transfer and that knowledge transfer of that is just a pain point. Technology, I know we all see all of the changes with technology, and it's changing faster now than ever before. We're seeing so many organizations moving to the cloud, being hesitant. How does the cloud and server-based software applications, how do they relate and work together? That's a huge challenge. And then integration. Today, we're seeing a lot more organizations integrate data and integrate applications than before. So we're reducing the data entry and the manipulation that we have to have. We're seeing a lot more remote and fractional teams, so or portions of them. All of that is increasing. Even, at our office, we have people who are here, who are in Washington, who are in Texas, who are in South Carolina, all over the place. And there are increased challenges, on our finance teams to make sure that we're really aligned lockstep. It's showing some of, don't want to use the word weakness, but it's definitely showing some areas that we have opportunity to improve consistency and improve kind of that mapping process that we have. We're also seeing the compliance landscape becoming a bit more complex. Everything within the legislative and the policy realm that's changing currently this year in particular, but that's changing is changing our compliance metrics. We have a lot of different funding sources asking for different reports. We're diversifying our revenue stream, which again is changing how we report to those funders or those members or those compliance agencies. We're seeing an increased need for real-time reporting, and the pressure always comes back to that finance team. How do we get every report out quicker? How do I make decisions better? All of that is because we've got an abundance of data, if you will, and we need to be able to rely on that data to make very quick and agile decisions. We're also seeing an increased risk from cyber threats. It doesn't directly relate to the finance team, but clearly everything in the finance realm is confidential. Everything is, it's critical for us to make sure that is secure. BDO, which we are part of the BDO Alliance at Maynard Costerisan, and every year they do a benchmarking report for nonprofit organizations. Some of the things for 2024, 25 isn't released yet, but some of the things that I thought were interesting, 73% of the respondents in this survey say they plan to meaningfully expand or shift the scope of their mission in the next 12 months. How does this impact finance? From a very basic level, this changes every report that we issue because our job is to tell the right story to our stakeholders. That's ultimately what every finance department as a whole has to do, which means if our organization is shifting a focus or a mission or shifting anything in that scope, we likely are going to have some shifts as well. Some other things is the benchmarking report ask leaders, how are they adjusting spending in different areas from the previous year to the current year? And you can see there's lots of different areas, but I'll point out technology. Almost 50% or 50% of organizations are shifting some funds to technology, 45% to risk management and compliance. Again, that definitely aligns in the finance and accounting department. Systems, it went down slightly from 23, but we're still seeing significant funds and significant focus being on our finance and accounting system. And then hiring new talent, that actually increased from the previous year. We know that organizations are having to shift funds and shift focus into hiring talent. So we see a lot of this impacting our finance departments. The other thing I thought was interesting is I see another poll that just popped up. If you want to take a minute and answer that question, if you do need CPE. The other question I thought was really interesting is just talking about artificial intelligence and where are what are the leading areas that your organization as a nonprofit is considering or currently using AI? And 44% of the respondents that said they are either already using AI or intend to use AI in the coming months within financial tasks. This really changes dramatically our financial responsibilities and how we're approaching our responsibilities and functions within the finance department. So the next thing that we want to talk about is really structure. How do we assess our org chart as all of these things are changing? We talk about the different trends in the industry. How do we make sure that our finance department isn't the same as it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, because we know what we're doing is not the same. Some of the different titles that we see when we work with organizations, obviously there's a CFO, there's the VP of Finance, Director of Finance, Controller, different levels of accountants, analysts, bookkeepers, coordinators, clerks, grants, and different managers, contracts managers. There's all of these different roles. And again, I'll say historical roles within your organization that we have to make sure that we're taking a look at these roles and they're still applicable. They're still relevant for where we want to be. The other reason it's so important to look at these roles is we're going out to market. As we talked, one of the trends is organizations are seeing that shift. They're seeing a lot of people transition out of their roles, looking for new hires. Do we have the right roles out there as we continue to hire people? We need to make sure that we're not just hiring to fill a position. We're evaluating the process and making sure we actually need that position when we look to refill. There's all sorts of tools and resources. As we said, the second bullet point on the trends, technology has changed at a faster pace. There are things and opportunities that we have to change the role and the procedures that we're doing that we didn't have 3 years ago, 5 years ago even. So some of the things that we see in organizations as we're assessing or as you're assessing the structure of your finance department is outdated titles and unclear responsibilities. Again, part of this is just due to the simple fact that technology has changed. So we see titles that maybe aren't relevant and specifically responsibilities under those titles that may just not make sense anymore, or they do make sense. We just need to tweak them to be a bit more clear. We recommend absolutely looking at job descriptions and expectations and making sure that they align with what we're actually doing and what our teams are actually doing, but also what we want our teams to be doing. Sometimes we'll come into an organization or we'll be part of an outsourced engagement and we look at the roles and responsibilities in the job descriptions, and it's really easy, if they're updated, to say, this maybe doesn't make sense, or this isn't the most useful or the highest and best use of this employee's skill set or time. And it's very apparent when we review and update these things. The next thing that we look at and we see are misaligned layers of supervision. It's very difficult to see who reports to who's kind of leading the charge towards making sure that the finance and accounting department is very high functioning and rolling along smooth. It's difficult, and what we recommend is clear accountability charts. What are the metrics? What are the measures to make sure that every employee, every team member in the finance department knows what their role is, who they report to, and how do they know that they're doing a good job? It really helps from an HR perspective. It really helps people when you're doing evaluations on an annual basis. If people know what they're supposed to be doing, which seems obvious, but what they're supposed to be doing, who they're reporting to, and how do they know if they're doing a good job? One easy kind of accountability chart area is related to accounts payable. So we look at an accounts payable, whether it's an analyst, accountant, or a clerk. How does that position know that they're doing a good job, and who do they report to? Do they report to the CFO? Sometimes not. Sometimes there's a layer in between there, but whoever that controller, whoever that role is that we identify that accounts payable person is directly reporting reporting to, how do they know they're doing a good job? And some of the metrics that we've seen organizations start to implement, and again, this is just an example, but how many electronic payments are you posting instead of physical checks being issued? The goal is to reduce the number of physical checks. It decreases cost, it decreases the time that people are spending filing and mailing and all the things. And that's a really great measure to say, hey, I'm improving the process. I'm not just doing my job, but as an accounts payable individual, I'm improving the process and improving things for the organization. The other thing that we're seeing is growth and change without structure or documentation, and that just leads to inefficiency. There's the old saying, if it's not written down, it doesn't really exist. We go in and often organizations, there are lots of processes, or policies that are in place, and I'll put air quotes there because somebody thinks it's a policy, somebody thinks it's in place, but it's not written down. And I would say if it's not written down, there's very little chance that the next person coming into that role is going to do it the same way. There's even a reduced chance if a person after that comes in, because now it's like that game of telephone where by the end of the row, it's a completely different message, a completely different process than what's going on. So we definitely recommend, and we like to see transactional flow charts, efficiency studies to make sure that, again, as we're looking at our total structure, we're not just looking at filling a role, filling a 5, 10, 50-year-old job position. We're evaluating the job position. We're making sure that we know who they're reporting to, what that accountability structure looks like, so that we can measure and make sure that that person has the right support, has the right training, has the right measurements to make sure that they feel successful in their job. And then also making sure that we're consistently looking to increase our efficiencies every single day. Make sure that that is reflective in all of our documentation. The next thing that we look at, so we've talked about the trends, we've looked at our structure, and we know how we kind of go about looking at what's going on out there in our organizations. Now we need to look at, are there gaps, or where are there gaps? Because usually the answer is yes, there are gaps. Our job in leadership's job is to really look at what are the reasons that we have these gaps, like what are our pain points, and then what do we do about that? So some of the pain points that we see when we're doing these gap assessments are delays. If there are continual pushes, if you've got often see there's some efficiency projects, some things that will really be critical to helping move the organization or move the reporting process or moving the funding streams forward. But those projects are delayed because people don't have time or something is pushed. That's a huge red flag, and it's a pain point because that really inhibits the organization from moving its mission and its strategic plan forward. We also see pain points: turnover. If there is consistent turnover in an organization or in a position, that could mean that the job description just isn't correct. We've seen, unfortunately, frequently, whether it's a CFO or a VP of finance position being hired, someone comes in that's new to the organization and they think they're going to be operating at that CFO or VP of finance level. In actuality, the need is at the controller level, and those are two completely different skill sets. I'm not saying one person can't do them all, but oftentimes one person can't be at their highest and best, trying to kind of shift between bookkeeper to controller to CFO. That's just a difficult balance to maintain. And because of that, we've seen some turnover. Again, going back to the structure and the job descriptions, that's why it's so important to make sure that that's defined throughout the hiring process, but for existing employees as well. Another red flag or pain point is if there's rushed reporting, stressful deadlines. Finance is not surgery, right? Finance and accounting should be repeatable. Finance and accounting should be relatively low key. I'm not saying that we don't have deadlines. Everybody has deadlines. Month end is always a bit more hectic, But our goal as finance leaders and leaders in the organization is try to reduce the number of surprises, try to streamline things to kind of level set expectations, to try to level out kind of those stressful moments and make it's a better working environment for everyone. And the biggest thing that we see and the biggest risk area, I guess, is missed opportunities. When there is a gap in whether it's the capacity, how much time and resource your team has, or a gap in skill set, you're going to miss opportunities. If you have an individual that has been promoted over the years from bookkeeper to senior accountant to controller to VP to CFO, but there's a skill set gap, you're going to miss opportunities because they just don't have the training and expertise, maybe experience that they need. Similarly, if you have a CFO that is phenomenal at strategic planning, at looking at the vision of the finance department and aligning that with the vision of the organization, but they don't have the technical skills to tweak the reporting structure that a controller would need, and they're trying to operate both, you're still going to miss opportunities because the reporting is so critical from a financial perspective to be able to tell the story of the organization, where you have been, but also where you want to go and what impact you're having for either members or whatever stakeholders you have. So what we talk about when you identify these gaps, again, oftentimes you're starting to look at the process, look for efficiencies, look at pain points. When we go in and we talk to organizations, or when leaders are talking to their teams about why there are these pain points or challenges, why are we so rushed at every single deadline? Why is it like pulling teeth to get some reports out? Or why do we think that people are kind of turning over in the finance department? We really look at, are there things that we as an organization need to do to help improve, the process? And oftentimes it's because the process that was in place 10 years ago just doesn't work anymore. There's things that we can do to improve that, but we need to empower our teams to be able to look at that, be curious about what could happen. If there's anything, we talk to a lot of finance teams about this, if there's anything that feels clunky, look into it, ask about it, bring it up at a finance department meeting or an accounting team meeting and say, hey, this feels clunky. It feels like it could be a bit more efficient. Is there anything that we're missing? And, sometimes that's easy to see internally, but sometimes it's not. That's why peer groups are so critical. If there's other organizations like yours or on the same software, all the different things, it's really, really important to empower your team to take advantage of those roundtables and those different groups to be able to look for efficiencies, because that will help your organization, your team be able to do more value add things that they feel that they're valuable to the organization. Throughout this process, it's really challenging all of our team members to embrace AI, to embrace automation and see where it leads. I attended a seminar a few months ago, and it was really about how to incorporate artificial intelligence into any organization is really what they were talking about. And one of the things that the leaders on the call said, they encouraged their team at the beginning of every single meeting, they had to talk about AI. And it seems a bit silly at first, right? How are you using AI? Do you use ChatGPT? Do you use other search engines in this way? But it's more than that. And their point was, once you start doing that and you make it part of every single meeting, slowly it builds into your culture. So you're training people to always be thinking, how can I automate this? How can I use AI to help me in my job? Not because years ago, we heard a lot of people, well, AI will make my job go away. That's not the goal. The position will be there. It will just be doing more value add things. So there's the ability for employees to learn something new, to be excited about, a new opportunity that they might have. The other thing, so this is kind of efficiencies. Is there enough time in the day to do things? The other challenge that we see, sometimes it's just the skill set. I mentioned earlier that people sometimes get promoted because of length of service instead of skill set, or they get put the job description maybe is not quite accurate. So they get this promotion before they're ready. And the organization doesn't necessarily invest in that training because it is, we're giving you this opportunity, now go and be successful. That's not always the best case. There's lots of opportunities for additional training and skill building and working with organizations or working with team members rather to ensure that they've got the right resources and the skill sets to function at a high level. One of the things that we've seen increased use of within our client base is some testing, skills testing. This is technical testing for accounting for nonprofit skills. And it's really, really beneficial because it isn't used as, a slap on the hand that you don't know how to do something. It's used as kind of, let's level set and see what areas you might need to improve or you might need additional training on so that the organization can support them in improving those skills or changing their career path or giving them more opportunities and things of that nature. And it again, part of it is making sure that it's communicated the correct way using a test because nobody likes to score poorly on a test, but the scores aren't A through F. The scores are, these are areas of opportunity that you can continue to expand your knowledge for your role. So the other thing, so after it looks like good timing. There is another CPE poll if you want to take a moment and click on that. So we've talked about kind of the trends, what we're seeing. We've talked about looking at structure of finance departments and some gaps that we see, some risk areas, some pain points that we see. So now looking at today, what are the options that organizations have for a finance and accounting team? And really, in my mind, it breaks down into three big picture groups. The internal team, everybody is an employee of the organization. An outsourced team, everybody is a contractor or an organization is a contractor, and then something in the middle, right? Like that encompasses everything. So I just wanted to take a minute and talk about kind of the pros and cons, and this is obviously a very short list, so there are all sorts of things, but the pros and cons of all of the different levels. And Jodi went over kind of as an organization evolves, what does their HR team look like? Some of that can also be applied in the finance realm. Not all, but some of it certainly can. So an internal team, obviously 100% is internal for all functions. The smaller or the newer organization, oftentimes the finance team even is wearing multiple different hats. And quite honestly, in most nonprofits, finance team members and all team members are wearing multiple different hats because a huge reason that organizations have the team that they do is because they believe in the mission. But what are the pros? So pros for an all internal team is access. Everybody is on the same team 100% of the time, right? Everybody is available. We see each other's schedules. We're communicating on the same platforms. We should be able to follow all the same rules. We've got the same culture, the same handbook, the same policies that we need to abide by. The cons could potentially be a skill or expertise gap. So oftentimes, like I said, as you're moving through the different stages of maturity, as Jodi mentioned, you may have an increased need for a CFO level, or you may have an increased volume of transactions for some grant period or something like that. So you might need a different skill set, but you've got the group of people that you have. So it's harder to be flexible for those things. And sometimes people get put in a position where they're doing something that isn't their highest and best use. The key is to continually focus on process improvement. And again, this is to ensure that everybody's working with the skills that they have, continuing to improve, seeing opportunities in their career, and continuing to evaluate the processes. One thing I've seen, again, in the first slide that we went over is just the trends, the increased change in technology, everything technology, right? We're seeing so many changes. Sometimes when you go into finance departments or any department, if somebody set up a process, there's a little bit of hesitancy to change that process because it was put there for a reason. Now, everything should be evaluated at least on an annual basis. Just review it because there are so many new developments in the technological world. We just can't dismiss it, and we can't think even 2 years go by that we are still doing things in a best practices sort of way. There's lots of opportunities there. So if fully internal team, it's critical that you really set aside time to focus on that. An outsourced team, this is fully outsourced. So you have administrative people generally that are a liaison to the outsourced finance team, but you've got outsourced accounts payable, outsourced accounting team that records all of your dues, your revenue, make sure that any integrations are functioning appropriately, an outsourced controller kind of preparing the financial statements and doing the reporting, and an outsourced CFO. So you have that flexibility. You may need some CFO skill sets at some points to do some strategic planning, to talk about kind of a business plan for a new, whether it's a subset of the nonprofit, a new program that you're looking at, to decide whether or not it makes good business sense to apply for a grant opportunity. Because I think we all know sometimes we get the funding and it actually ends up costing us money to fulfill some of these things, which that's not all bad. We just have to go into it eyes wide open. The CFO skill set is very, very important in helping us to do that. The pros, you've got the appropriate skill for every task. So if you're outsourcing to a firm or a group of people, generally, you don't have to worry so much about turnover. You as an organization don't have to worry so much about transitions and training. That's done by the firm or that's done by the outsourced team, whether it's an individual that you're outsourcing to or not. So that's really beneficial. You don't have the risk, as much of a risk of having a CFO level person at a higher salary rate doing a bank reconciliation, for example. The cons is it is intended to be a more structured schedule. So one of the challenges that I've seen organizations go through when they're going from an internal to an outsourced or hybrid team is you're used to just pop-in meetings and you're used to side conversations. And that's just a bit more difficult when you have an outsourced team. There's a need to be more structured. That doesn't mean part of the structure is having some flexibility. That doesn't mean that at all. You just have to say, Mondays, I'm going to be in the office all day. So if there's a day that we're going to have these pop-in meetings and in planning or whatever it is, you just have to over communicate. This still works very well. The key is to embrace the expertise in the process. So oftentimes, if you are moving to a full outsourced team, there may be recommendations to change the process, change the software, change something. Be open to that because you're hiring this outsourced person or this outsourced team because of their expertise and because of their skill set. Trust it. The other bucket is hybrid. So this is a blend of internal employees and contractors. And honestly, this is probably what I see the most frequently is some sort of a blend here. Sometimes it is a CFO is on site and they contract out the more transactional pieces. Sometimes it's kind of a flip. You've got people that do all of the transaction, do the record keeping, but you outsource a CFO or that strategic level. And that model is really great for some organizations that are in kind of that growth mode that Jodi mentioned earlier, because then it allows you to tap into the CFO, the strategy, the visionary sorts of things, the talking about structure and process as needed or periodically instead of really paying for that throughout the entire year. The pros, again, you've got these safeguards, you've got backups, you're still getting the appropriate skill set and you have ongoing access. The ongoing access is because you still have people on site that you can still turn to at a moment's notice to get a report that you maybe don't know how to run, something like that. Sometimes that's a bit of a time lag in a fully outsourced team. The cons, occasionally there's communication issues. The key is to make sure that you have an accountability structure that makes sense so that if it is an outsourced CFO, make sure that they're in the right meetings. Make sure that you're getting their buy-in at the right times, or vice versa. Make sure that, you've got the right communication mechanism for the transactional team if needed. And the key in a hybrid situation is really making sure, and quite honestly, the key in an outsource, one of the other keys in an outsource team is making sure that you are all one team. Everybody's working on the same page. There's not a contractor or a vendor or a consultant or a outsourced team or outsourced accounting person out there that wants to be looked at as a vendor. We want to be, or they want to be part of your team. So then, Jodi, if you want to pop back on, we can talk a little bit about kind of the overlap between HR and finance and accounting.
If you had another visual coming up. Sarah, I appreciate the deep dive that you did when you were talking about skills assessment and the need to be really clear about job function and what a good job looks like, because that typically falls in the lap of HR to create those sorts of documents that would define that. HR is typically the one that's leading the charge on employee evaluations and the assessment as to whether or not we have the right people in the right seats. And if we feel like we don't, are we going to train up existing staff so that they become the right people? Are we going to change the seats? Are we going to hire, the talent? Are we going to outsource part of it? So this really is a strategy discussion. HR is a part of that, but finance is a part of that too, because you can have all these great ideas, but can we afford it? For how long? What's the best use of our dollars? But those two entities, HR and finance, are often talking throughout the day, throughout the week. They aren't as siloed as one might think, because sometimes you think, oh, HR is people and finance is numbers. But, the two go together, sort of like money and mission go together. So anytime there's an employee change, often HR is going to know about it. Let's say I'm getting married, I'm getting divorced, we're adopting. My husband lost his job, so now he lost his benefits, so now I need to come on to our benefits. Or we're going through some difficult times and I have this medical expense I can't pay, and you're going to see a wage garnishment come through for that. Often changes that might be reflected in payroll have a life circumstance tied to them. And depending on the comfort level of the employee and the setup that you have within your organization, that employee will share those details with certain individuals, and it's not necessarily governed by the title on the door. So if I have a really good relationship with somebody that sits in finance, I might go tell them about it. But maybe my relationship is with my manager or the head of the organization, or maybe you have an internal HR person and they've worked really hard to develop the rapport there. You're going to find out about life circumstances that might have a tie on the payroll side or the benefit administration side. And so making sure that there is good communication there. And it's a need to know basis, right? We're still, even though we might still be, maybe we both work, accounting and HR are both internal W-2 employees for the nonprofit. Employee comes and tells one of those two departments all of these kind of nitty-gritty details about their life. That department has to go tell the other department just the need to know stuff so that they can process their piece of this. We're not going to share any of those additional details because we still have to protect the confidentiality for the employee. So those employee changes, employee communication is another big one. For example, I've seen a lot of times where let's say the nonprofit offers benefits. They offer health insurance, they offer dental, something like this. And then it's time for open enrollment and we get the rate increases. And so we make some changes to our benefit plan. Often finance is going to be in those meetings because they're running the numbers. But it may not be finance that's communicating what this actually means to an employee. Maybe HR is part of that because maybe there's an education session around how to get the most use out of your benefits and and what this means for your paycheck and how to make smart choices. And so that's another example of where the communication piece, you kind of have to decide who's going to spearhead that. And then payroll is kind of an obvious one, I think.
Yeah, that's a really great example because I think you're right. Oftentimes, from a finance and accounting perspective, we're very focused on how do we reduce costs for the organization. That's just part of the job, right? And that, I mean, the largest percentage of most budgets are salaries and benefits or some sort of faction of that. So we're always looking at how we can reduce our benefit costs, all of the things, but it's really easy to just kind of look in a silo from a finance perspective and want to look for reduced rates. And I think this is the last CPE poll that just came through. If you want to take a look and make sure you click that. But from a finance perspective, it's really easy to do that. And it's interesting how many times we see a proposal from finance on reducing benefits that HR hasn't heard about, or vice versa. HR does all this work and it's nowhere to be found in the budget projections that the finance team is looking at over the next year or how that impacts 2 years out. So that communication, I completely agree. The other thing that I've seen some challenges, if there's not the right amount of communication, is related to payroll taxes and dealing with the IRS. Sometimes those notices will come through the HR department and they'll try to follow up directly without a whole lot of experience dealing or working with the IRS. So sometimes that's not a perfect fit either. So I think at the end of the day, like Jodi mentions, it's really, really critical to just make sure the expectations are outlined, the skill sets are kind of documented so everybody knows what experience the different individuals have. But those overlaps are always a little bit tricky to maneuver through. So I think we're pretty close to the end. So we've got time, a few minutes. If there are any questions out there, we do have the contact information for Jodi and myself. And obviously, you can reach out to the main or email. We will be providing the slideshow as well as a recording of this webinar to all attendees and those registered. Kimberly, did you have any questions that came through?
Yes, I think we may have time for one that came in. We're a small nonprofit. Our treasurer has generally handled HR activities. If we decide to outsource the HR function, to what position in our organization would or should that third party relate or report to? Our executive director or our treasurer?
I have my opinions on this.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think HR should always have, if not a direct line, a dotted line to the top decision maker in the organization. I think funneling HR exclusively to a finance, a kind of a chief finance role, while helpful with the communication piece, is somewhat limiting in other areas. And there are situations that the head decision maker might know about in terms of strategic planning and some of those mission-driven discussions that are going to require staffing support behind them. Finance might not be a part of that yet. So my preference would always be to have a direct, if not a dotted line, to the top.
Great. Well, thank you very much, ladies. We appreciate the valuable information that you have shared with us. And to our attendees, as Sarah mentioned, their contact information is here on this slide and will be shared when we send out the slide deck and the webinar recording in the coming weeks. And so please watch for that email. If you have any additional questions, please feel comfortable to reach out to Sarah or Jodi or both. We've gotten a lot of great information, and sometimes those questions come up later on as you're encountering situations. We also want to invite you to check out our events page. We do have our next nonprofit education series webinar on August 14th. So we invite you to register for that event and to subscribe to our newsletter to get the latest and greatest information coming out from Maynard Costerisan. We hope you have a wonderful day and week ahead. And thank you again for attending. And thank you, Sarah and Jodi, for your presentations.
Thank you.
Everyone.